Good afternoon, everyone. We will be starting shortly. We're just going to give everyone some time to access the webinar, and we'll probably start at around 1:02. Thanks.
Oh, sure.
Okay, it's just gone 1:02, so I think we're going to start. First of all, thank you everyone for joining us again on this Friday afternoon. I'm very excited that we get to kick off our new webinar series with such an interesting and very relevant topic. So today we're going to hear from Dr. Nikki Crew, who's a senior lecturer in the Department of Plant and Soil Sciences and the Forestry and Agricultural Biotechnology Institute at the University of Pretoria. She's going to share knowledge on planting dates and how shifting climates might impact these. And I think we're in for a very interesting session. But before I hand over to Dr. Crew, just some household rules. Please add in comments or questions in the chat box, and we'll get to them at the end of the session. We've disabled the mic for the participants just to ensure a good flow of events, but you're more than welcome to add anything in the comment section, and we'll get to it at the end of the session. And then, of course, for those who are participating in the CropLife CPD program, the assessment will be available on the CPD system in category 2 of the online modules if you are a CPD participant. Okay, so thanks so much, Dr. Crew, for taking the time to speak to us today, all the way from France, I believe. So without further ado, please take it away. Sorry, Dr. Crew, I think you are muted. Sorry about that.
And now?
Perfect.
Right.
We can hear you.
Sorry. So, as you heard, I'm Nikki Crew. I'm from the University of Pretoria in the Forest and Agricultural Biotechnology Institute, also known as FABI for short. And today I thought I'd talk to you guys a little bit about evaluating planting windows in a changing environment to maintain crop resilience. And this is some of the work we've been doing in my team over the last about 6 years. So before we start, I thought I'd tell you a bit about what FABI is. So FABI is a postgraduate institute with the goal of bringing industry, university, and government partners together to answer important questions facing forestry and agricultural industries. We span 2 different faculties at the university, the Natural and Agricultural Sciences faculty and the Engineering, Built Environments, and IT faculty. And so we have members and researchers from many different departments in these faculties, from zoology and entomology, biochemistry, genetics, and microbiology, the plant and soil science department, where my team sits, and then also the computer science department. So what is the goal of FABI? Well, the goal of FABI is to be working on really basic research that can be translated into applied systems. And with this, we add a service component with the idea of providing specialist services based on the latest technology and knowledge in a non-profit framework. And together, these things fit together in a cog with training, so that our students are getting training on both sides of the situation. And this enhances the training of technical professionals in specialist areas and it provides integrated services with a research component. So how does that actually look? Well, one example is we have a large group, including my own, who are members of the National Grain Research Program. This is directed by Professor Kobus Visagie. I just want to get a pointer here. By Professor Kobus Visagie. And one of the things we do is we have a pest and pathogens diagnostics clinic. And we have a fairly simple online process if you'd like to submit a sample for evaluation. And then with that, we also have a large group of extension officers who are continually doing surveys across the country for various agricultural and forestry pests. So where does all this information go? Well, at the University of Pretoria, we have the Information Hub, which is a cloud-based, community-driven self-help data platform for transdisciplinary scientific research. So that's a lot of words to say. It houses various projects in a cloud-based setting, and this allows us as researchers to share our information easily with either privately with companies or government partners, or once it's ready for publication, it can be displayed directly on the Innovation Africa website. And this process is monitored and directed by Prof. Bernard Slippers. And so what can we do with this information? Well, we can take the information from the extension units, from the diagnostics clinic, from any other trapping that we're doing. We often work with CropWatch Africa. I think they have a new name now, but I forget it. And we can build all of these data platforms into one place and actually provide real-time mapping of these pests and pathogens. And so we're focusing first on building national forest pest and disease surveillance tools, but this can easily be transferred to agricultural industry as well once we've built up the database from the diagnostic clinic and the extension services, and from anyone who's providing information to our group as well. So what does my team do? Where do we fit in? Well, we call ourselves CFBE, or the Crop, Floral, Biology and Environments team. And we focus predominantly on sunflower and maize production and development. And we're really interested in how the plants, and specifically their flowers, respond to environmental change. And so when you're doing this kind of work, one of the first things you have to do is plant phenotyping. So we have a large group of students and collaborators working on plant phenotyping. We collaborate with Dr. Dirk Swanefelder at the Agricultural Research Center, where the Agricultural Research Council, where they've installed the new PhenoSpecs high throughput phenotyping system. We also have students who sit within the remote sensing lab, which is a satellite lab at FABI, but is directed by Prof. Wouter Maas at Ghent University. And here we're looking at thermal and multispectral imaging. And then, because my team is a founding member, or is one of the members of the Center of Excellence for Plant Health Biotechnology, we also focus on pathogens and how they shift or change under environmental conditions, and how this influences plant growth, development, and yield. And then finally, I have a small team of students who are trying to understand the genetics behind these responses that we are seeing. Because if you know there's a genetic component, you can actually know their scope for breeding for better or more resilient crops in the future. So I'm sure you can all remember the big news and big disaster of the day zero drought in Cape Town a few years ago, probably from about 2016 to 2019 is when the drought occurred. Well, this is a spatial variation of that same drought period across the Free State province. And when you get these kind of massive droughts or extreme weather events, they always come hand in hand with a number of different new sensational news headlines. Is rainfall shifting in South Africa? Is climate change damaging our crops? And so on and so on. And so what do we actually know about climate change in South Africa? So Engelbrecht et al. Predicted that Southern Africa is expected to warm at up to 2 times the rate of the global average. That means for every one, if the world is warming up to 1.5 degrees, we could be going up to as much as 3 degrees, which is very significant. And so Lotte et al. From the CSIR, they did a really nice study where they looked at how this projected or expected change is going to affect this land suitability for various crops across the country. So these maps show the land suitability for maize under our current situation, and then under climate change predictions into the mid and the far future. And you can see that as this climate change progresses, the land availability is getting smaller and smaller for maize production, or suitability is getting smaller. So when we start talking about climate change, you always have at least one person who will ask you, well, is it really climate change? Or is it just seasonal variability driven by our wet-dry cycles that we have naturally in South Africa? And the answer is that it's really a bit of both. So if we were to look at a climate that's has much less seasonal variability, maybe like the UK or the Netherlands, it's very easy to see when there's an upward trend towards temperatures or a shift that's happening due to climate change and a continual change in an upward direction. But in a country like South Africa, where we have very high seasonal variation, these big up and down turns make it much harder and mask the gradual but steady increase in temperatures that we're seeing over time. So with all of this in mind, Grain SA came to us with a few questions they thought we would be able to answer. The first was, are the rains actually coming later? Because you'll often hear farmers talking about, oh, the rains are coming later each year, especially in a drought period. And then there's, and then the next question is, well, how might climate change affect our planting dates in the future? And what factors contribute to poor yields at later planting dates, especially when you're forced to plant late? So I had a postdoc in the team, Dr. Mangani, who decided to first look at if we're warming so rapidly at 2 times the global rate, we should be able to see signatures already of warming in our historical data. So he took historical data over a 30-year period from the three of our major agricultural provinces, and he looked at 6 different districts: Zwazirenica, Klerksdorp, Bloemfontein, Bethlehem, Standerton, and Lydenburg. And he mostly tried to get these in different agroecological zones, as is indicated by the different colors on the map, except for up here, because most of the province is in one agroecological zone. And so he just used 2 locations that were as far apart as he could get them for a good spatial variation. And when he looked at trends in the weather data, he did see, as we expected, that in most locations, the temperatures are in fact getting warmer, as is predicted by climate change, and have already gotten warmer. And this could either be a gradual increase over time, but also we saw signatures where there were more days above 35 degrees now than there were 30 years ago in many of these locations. He also found that there seemed to be rainfall shifting, but these shifts happened in localized districts. So Lydenburg appeared to have rainfall that was ending earlier in the season, while in Bethlehem it does appear that there is a trend for later rains. And in Klerksdorp, we're seeing less rain overall. And this shows that you can't just take a provincial look and plot it against every district, because you're going to miss some of the nuances that are actually water related. So if you would like to read more about this work, it's all published in this article that's freely available online, and I'm happy to share links with you for any of the papers that I've discussed. And with this, there is actually good news, because when we looked at the maize yields over this time period, they were consistently going up, even though the weather patterns were shifting. And this tells us a few things. One, it means that the farmers are being able to, at the moment at least, adjust and readjust to maintain and improve their yields, even with the shifts in climate. But I think there's also something important to note in this data, is that two big events happened during this time period that really improved the maize yields significantly. And one of those was there was a rapid importation of really sophisticated mechanization strategies, the tractors and all of the equipment that goes with that. And then the second thing is that during this time period, the GMOs, or genetically modified maize crops, were brought into the country. So that's your BT and your Roundup Ready crops. And those two things had a massive influence on the increase in yields during this time period. So if we can see that the weather has already changed over the last 30 years in this direction, can we extrapolate into the future how this weather might continue, or how these patterns might continue to change? So Dr. Mangani teamed up with Prof. Gunn at the University of Wisconsin in Green Bay, and they did a modeling study where they looked at a moderate climate scenario and a severe climate scenario with 4 different planting dates. And they modeled the growth patterns of a short maturing maize variety and a medium maturing maize variety. And then they looked at 3 different timeframes. They looked at the baseline, which is now currently what we have. They looked at oh, my point is gone. They looked at the mid-future, which goes up to 2050, and then they looked at the far future, which goes all the way up to 2080. And one of the first things that they saw was that as we move to the future, the frost dates are moving further apart from each other. So that means our summers are getting longer and hotter, or longer. But we also can show that the summers are getting hotter. So here they broke the maize development into a vegetative phase or a reproductive phase. So the vegetative phase is where the plant is accumulating biomass and growing actively, while the reproductive phase is where the plants are silking, flowering, and seed filling as they continue. And we didn't see much difference between medium and short varieties across the different modelings. But what we did notice is in the December planting date, which is the optimal planting date for Bloemfontein and Lichtenburg normally, we found that in the future, these planting dates will have a reproductive phase that is exposed to far more days above 35 degrees Celsius than what we normally can anticipate. And this is really bad news for maize production in particular, because maize is very temperature sensitive, and especially so during the reproductive phase. We did notice that in the projections that we were doing, that the later January planting date, the reproductive phase was experiencing far fewer days above 35 degrees Celsius. And the next thing we did was we actually mapped the maize crops days to reach maturity under the different climate scenarios. And whether we looked at the severe climate scenario or the moderate climate scenario, we saw the same trend both for medium and short growing cultivars, where the days to maturity are decreasing as climate change progresses. And so if we look right up to 2090 or 2080, you can see that we have a significant decrease in what's normally our days to maturity for either crop. Again, we noticed the later planting date also declined in their days to maturity, but this happened to go from a much higher one to what we normally anticipate in the future. And so what this work tells us is that as climate change progresses, it's going to be really important for us to monitor our planting windows and make sure that we are still aligning our growth and development of our plants with the appropriate climatic conditions, because these may well shift as the summers get longer and hotter. So if I give you a little summary of the work, the climate modeling work, we show that climates have changed in major agricultural districts over the last 30 years. District level assessments and predictions indicate that provincial level policies are estimations do not actually tell the whole story, and we need to go to district level. And I think it highlights the importance of continually re-evaluating our planting dates as climate change progresses. So what's in a planting date? Well, my team joined the Grain South Africa's Climate Resilience Consortium, and we formed a collaboration with Dion du Toit at the Agricultural Research Council and Gert Saronio at the University of the Free State. And we've been running a large trial for the last 6 seasons now. This is a little bit of an older slide, so this is showing 3 seasons, but we actually have 6 seasons now. And we planted 4 different planting dates, 6 different cultivars across 6 different locations. And if you want to see all the locations for the 3 seasons data, it was published here in the SA Grain magazine, if you'd like to look at that later. But overall, across the seasons, across the districts, across the cultivars, we saw this continuous trend where if you plant in January, you're losing at least up to 50% of your yield if you go from 15 December to 15 January. And this is pretty constant across all of the different seasons that we've looked at, saying that maize has a very constrained planting date. I had a PhD student who then took this challenge up and actually looked at a sunflower planting date. And she did only 2 seasons across 2 locations. But we found quite a different result with the sunflower planting date trials. And sunflower seems to be much more responsive to the seasonal variation as it occurs. So in the first season, which is represented up here at the top, it was a very hot and very dry season. And what we found was that the sunflower yields reduced, but they also seemed to stabilize across several different planting dates, all the way up to about the January planting date in both locations. And when we had looked at the second season, which was a much wetter season, we actually found that sunflower does much better the earlier you plant if there's good water availability. So the question then becomes, so what factors actually cause this these decreasing yields at later planting dates? And so if you ask any agronomist worth their salt, they will tell you it's absolutely temperature and heat units in the plants and water availability. Now, we wanted to understand how the change in these heat units and the change in water availability is actually affecting the plant's development and growth. So this is where we teamed up with Dirk Swanefelder at the ARC, and we planted our planting date trials, both our maize and our sunflower, under his new high throughput phenotyping system. So this system can scan the plants 3 times a day using RGB, which is red, blue, green, near infrared, and LiDAR. So LiDAR actually allows you to build 3D models of every plant in the row, and then you can measure height, leaf angle, or even biomass, project biomass from these measurements. So what did we see for our planting dates? If we looked at the maize planting dates, we actually saw a clear distinction between the November and December planting dates compared to the January and February planting dates. And the January and February planting dates actually grew much faster earlier in their lives. And this is actually problematic because if they're growing faster, it means they're maturing faster. And plants that mature faster put on less biomass. And if you have less biomass, you can make less sugars, which means this directly affects the yield outcome at the end of the day. And this was reflected in both the biomass readings and the height readings. While you can see that our November-December planting dates were growing much slower, but they continued their upward trend for much longer, meaning they bulked out better at the end of the day. What's really nice about the system is that it's very high resolution. And so you can actually start seeing differences across cultivars. So in the January planting date, everything seems to respond almost the same. While in the November planting date, we started to see differences in different cultivars, some that were growing much faster, some that were growing slower. And this would allow us to look at cultivars that maybe respond better to different planting dates over time. So what about water availability? So we've decided to use thermal imaging with the drones and multispectral imaging with the drones to assess how water availability is shifting over the planting dates. So what we have, so how does that work? How can you use thermal imaging on a plant? Well, if a plant is under water stress, it closes its stomata. Essentially, those are the holes in the leaves that allow it to breathe. If it's closed, it cannot transpire, which means it cannot cool itself. So a plant under water stress will close its stomata, but the internal temperature will go up. And we can actually image the differences in these temperatures of the plants. And so this is another study from another paper. And you can see these ones are much darker blue compared to these which are more water stressed in a later planting. This was in the States. And so we're looking to do a similar thing with my PhD student, Sizwe Mthembu. And what he's specifically looking at is this transition from the December planting date to the January planting date. So here he planted every week from December 15 to January 15, and we are monitoring these plants with thermal imaging, but we haven't done all the analysis yet, so I can't present any of those data. But he's also been monitoring the plants' physiology and their yields as the seasons progressed. And so what he could already see is that when we look at transpiration and photosynthesis, which tells us about how the plant is growing, we see that the last two planting dates, which are your January, first week in January and second week in January planting dates, there's already a shift to lower transpiration and lower photosynthesis. And when he started looking at, yes?
I'm so sorry to interrupt you. I wanted to ask, if you can see on your screen, there is something that says Teams Microsoft is sharing your screen. And then there's a stop. Could you press hard on that just because it covers some of the graphs?
There you go. Is that better?
Yes, perfect. Thank you very much. Please continue. Sorry for interrupting.
Okay. So you can see that once we look at seed weight, even the last week in December seems to be losing something. And so maize's planting date seems to be highly constrained compared to other crop species. So the next thing that we are interested in looking at is how pollination might be influencing yields at late planting dates. And we've also been trying to understand how pollination might work in sunflower, where we saw those kind of stabilized yields across several of the planting dates. And so I had a student, Uyamamela, who actually looked at how pollination in sunflowers is affected by heat waves. And so she looked at the timing of when pollen comes out of the flowers in a heat wave condition in red or under normal conditions in blue. And what we saw is that in sunflower, the pollen can come out much earlier in the day under a heat wave condition. And when she counted the number of insect visits or pollinator visits, she actually saw that there was an increase in insect visits earlier in the day and on heat wave plants, also in the red. And so what this can tell us is that sunflowers are adjusting their timing of pollen emergence to protect pollen from the high temperatures and to align the pollen timing with pollinator visits during a heat wave. And in this way, they're able to better maintain their pollination and seed production under these adverse conditions. So now I have an MSc student, Vera Roda, who's now looking to see if we can identify the genetic factors controlling this timing within the plant, because if we can show a genetic link, then that means we can study the variation across different cultivars, and we can start to look for cultivars that maybe are better at responding to these climatic changes and make sure that those genetic components are in the cultivars that we are using. So the next thing we actually looked at in terms of pollination and sunflower with heat stress was actually something that happened a little bit by accident. It was in our planting day trial for Fraser Mapumo's PhD. She had a set of plants in the field that were about 4 weeks old, so very young, when a heat wave struck. And this heat wave was really severe for these little plants. The leaves were very scorched, the plants were stunted, and as they grew up to maturity, they remained quite small with fairly small heads. So we assumed that the yield for that planting date was going to be pretty bad. But since we are a lab that's interested in flowers, I asked Fraser to also look at floral traits across the planting dates. And something we noticed that was, so we measured pollen viability, we measured stigma receptivity. So now stigma receptivity is the ability of the flower to receive pollen. And so and then we also measured the number of insect visits. And for these January plants that were hit with the heat wave when they were seedlings, a month later, when they flowered, they actually showed elevated stigma receptivity. So this actually means that they were better able to receive pollen than the other planting dates that we were looking at. And this was backed up by our seed measurements, where we found the number 3s, which are the representation of the January planting date, all seem to cluster around total seeds, filled seeds, and grain filling, meaning that it appeared these plants were better pollinated. So my honors student at the time, Jessica, was quite interested in this story, and she did a bit of reading, and she found a paper that suggested that in sunflower, the floral meristem forms about 2 to 3 weeks after planting. So the floral meristem is the precursor to the flower. It is the cells in the plant that is actually going to make the flower at the end of the day. And so if that floral meristem is there early in the plant's life, it's going to be exposed to the heat waves, to the drought stresses and everything along with the rest of the plant. And this possibly can influence flower traits. So Jessica took this up for her honors, and she did a experiment where she heat stressed some juvenile plants, and then she did microscope work looking at the apex of the sunflower where the floral meristem will sit. And what she found was that the heat stress actually changes the structure of the floral meristem at these young stages. And so a month or so later, when the plant flowers, this is impacting their floral development. So we were also interested in what is happening in maize flowers during this time. So we also looked at silk receptivity over the different planting dates. This was with my PhD student, Ofense Matsibile. And what we found, so this is also the ability of the silk to receive pollen and get pollinated. And what we found was that silk receptivity also shifts with the planting date over time. And so this shows you that it's not as simple as just water and heat units affecting the yield, but right at pollination, you are also going to be losing yield due to poorer pollination events. The last thing we decided to look at for factors that might be contributing to poor yields at late planting dates was disease presence and prevalence. So Dr. Fraser Mapumo, in her planting date trial across the sunflowers, she did a survey of all the different leaf symptoms she could see for all the different planting dates. And so for all of the diseases, but we know generally Alternaria is one of the more prevalent ones in sunflower here, but we found that the January, February, and March, so the very late planting dates, had significantly more disease incidence, so more disease, but also more different kinds of diseases. So overall, the pathogen load is heavier on the later planting dates, and this is likely influencing yield production as well. While she was doing the planting date trial, she also decided to do an inoculation trial to look at how planting date affects Sclerotinia head rot progression, and she published this paper last year, and it's also freely available, and I'm happy to share the links for these, where she could actually show that the later planting dates had much more disease progression in the head than the earlier planting dates, showing that even Sclerotinia, again, supporting the idea that later planting dates have a much heavier load in terms of disease. While she was doing this experiment and these surveys, she came across a symptom she hadn't seen before in the field. So she contacted our local plant virologist, Dr. David Reed, and the two of them together actually identified the symptoms to be caused by a virus known as Biden's mottle virus. And this is the first report of Biden's mottle virus in South Africa, and only the second in South Africa on sunflowers, and it's only the second report of a natural infection occurring in the world. And she actually managed to take a few yield seed traits with the infected plants, and we can show that there can be quite a significant influence of this disease on yields. And so this is an important disease for us to think about and pay attention to as we continue monitoring various fields and sectors. Okay, so we also did exactly the same thing with our maize planting date trials. So my MSc student, Johan Saliers, he's finishing up now. He actually did the same kind of survey as Fraser across our planting date trials in Bethlehem, Potchefstroom, and Pretoria, and he looked at about 7 different maize foliar diseases. And he saw pretty much the same thing that Fraser was seeing, is that at the later planting dates, there are more different types of diseases on the plants, and there are more disease symptoms on the plants. And this does make sense, because if you're planting your plants late, they can be a little bit more stressed, and so it's easier for a disease to attack. Also, at the later planting dates, the weather is becoming cooler and better for pathogens, and especially fungal pathogens. While he was doing this trial, we actually had a nice situation where we found out that one of our cultivars was resistant to northern corn leaf blight, while the other was susceptible. And so we could do a more detailed study on the northern corn leaf blight outbreaks across different planting dates. And what he showed was that in the susceptible one, The first planting date had moderate northern corn leaf blight outbreak, whereas the later planting dates had quite significant northern corn leaf blight incidences. But interestingly, even in the resistant cultivar, we noticed a slight increase in the number of lesions for northern corn leaf blight on the later planting dates. So this suggests one of two things. It can suggest that as the plants are planted later, they are much more stressed, and so they can't actually maintain that resistance and protect themselves from the northern corn leaf blight. Or alternatively, it's that there is a shift in the northern corn leaf blight population. So the strain that occurs early in the season might be different from the strain occurring later in the season, and maybe that strain later in the season is better at overcoming the plant's resistance. And so Johan is now working on this towards the end of his MSc, and we hope to understand a little bit more about this system as he goes along. Okay, so I think that's what I came here to talk about today. So I'm just going to summarize what we've discussed. Firstly, the factors we were looking at the factors associated with poor yields at late planting dates, and we investigated temperature and water availability and how they impact growth dynamics and limit growth if they are not at the right point. We also looked at we also showed that maize flowers are less receptive to pollen at late planting dates. Sunflowers seem to be better at adapting to heat stresses before and during flowering to maintain yields. And we show that diseases increase on late planting dates for both maize and sunflower. And this is really important because what this tells us is that it's not just temperature and water availability, because there's very little you can do about temperature. The temperature is what it is. You can't change the heat unit accumulation. I guess you can change water if you have access to irrigation for later planting dates. But what we can do is we can look at cultivars that perhaps have adjusted or shifted pollination mechanisms to make them more robust under these later planting dates. And the other thing is perhaps if we can think a bit more and explore a bit more how diseases function at late planting dates, perhaps we can tailor some of our disease control strategies to include this information to help maintain or at least pull back a little bit of this loss that we're seeing at later planting dates in the future. And then finally, I'm going to say it again because I've said it before, but I really think it's important that we're monitoring planting dates as the climates are shifting into the future. And with that, there's always a huge village of people that have to be thanked when you do this kind of research, from all the field teams, all our collaborators across the university and the country and the globe, and then to all our funders from OPOT, Grain South Africa, DSI, the Maize Trust, NRF, and our research partners, Free State and Agricultural Research Council. And thank you all for listening. I think I'm done.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, Dr. Crew, for such an insightful presentation. Really, really great stuff. And I can't think of a better topic to have kicked off our webinar series with. So thanks so much for your time and the effort here. I do see a hand, but I don't see any questions. So because everyone is muted, if there is a question, I'm going to give it 5 seconds. If I see someone typing, I'll wait a bit, but I don't see anyone typing in the chat box. But yes, of course, reach out to any member of the CropLife team if you have any questions. We'll put you in touch with Dr. Crew. And again, thank you so much. This was very insightful. Thanks for your time. And yeah, we look forward to working together again.
Okay, and like I said, I'm happy to share any links or any anything that I've touched on that you want more information on.
Excellent. Thank you so much. Have a great day, everyone, and a good weekend.
Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Bye.